in front of you kind of matters, versus what you see in abstract doesn't. I mean, right now, I mean, I'll give you a real true example. I have a good friend who was a neurosurgeon, and he was Canadian, but he's working in the U.S. And he's a kind of a strong proponent of private insurance and stuff. But the interesting thing is that when he was faced with a choice, his own internal moral structure came in, and I'll give you an example. So he would complete an operation. Neurosurgeons, they work a lot on the spine. So he could complete an operation, and his belief was that the person had to get up and going sooner than later. And one of the things that he also believed was that if you stay in a hospital, you could acquire hospital-acquired infections. And so he thought, wouldn't it be better to have people up and going and getting out of the hospital after surgery? And even though he's a proponent of private insurance and not shy of making money, one of the things that was interesting was that he was called into the vice president of finance offices, and he was told, you know, what are you doing? We have patients that are coming in here whose insurance allow them to stay in the hospital for 5 days, and you're discharging them after 3. What's going on? And my friend would say, well, you know, it's in their best interest individually for them to do that, to leave. But yes, but the hospital loses money. And it's an interesting thing that the discussion, in this case, the tangible, in this case, my friend who believed that it was in their direct patient's best interest, would say, no, I'm not going to change. But then on an abstract basis, very much is appreciative of the fact that, you know, people make money delivering healthcare. Another really good story is that a staff member who worked for me who was traveling abroad in India, who had a heart issue, in which case they diagnosed that she needed a stent thing in her heart. And she had pretty good insurance. And so they came to her and said this. They said, look, what we'd like to be able to do is to bill the insurance company for a particular type of procedure in a stent, even though you don't need it. We're not going to give you that procedure in stent, but we're going to bill the company for it. And we need you to sort of be okay with it if they ask you if you got that procedure. And they said the reason why they needed to do that was, you know, they would be, rather than being reimbursed at $1,000, they'd be reimbursed at $8,000. And the $7,000 difference, they were going to use it to treat patients who were not insured. So abstract ethics would be no, right? That's fraud, right? That's not. But tangible ethics, when you're studying right there, say, yes, I could see the fact that there were some really nice older people that didn't have enough money to be able to have this procedure done. So I'm going to allow this, so from a charitable perspective, they can have it done. Tangible, abstract. So what it's saying to us is that we have an ability to act on what we think is our moral strength. But then when we get into the situation, sometimes we don't do what we think we ought to do in hindsight. Does everybody sort of understand that, what we're talking about? Hello? Is everybody still there? Knock, knock, knock. Hello?
Yes, Professor.
So here's the thing. So I'm not trying to make things complicated. But what I'm trying to do is to sort of help you to realize that when you are acting in your place as an individual and acting in your place as a professional, are they different?
Yes, it is different. because
Yes,
like
Professor, it is a little different.
Why is that?
when we look like when we think professionally, we sometimes we think that it like the decision we make does not harm us. Maybe we cannot think about other people's sometimes. And as a part of individual, like if we want to make a decision, like we first think that it is affect us or not.
It does. And, it's so we personalize it. And thank you for both you guys, for Ruby and from Rajat. So Ruby, do you want to add something or?
Yes, Professor. Just like Rajat said, we will be morally more conscious when we are acting as an individual, and when we are professional, we will not be as morally conscious.
And I really like that, because let's just unpack that just for a minute. So I always say, it's funny when people go to work, they sometimes feel that being at work is personal. But I try to explain to people that when you're at work, you are not at work because you're Rajat or Hina or Ruby. You're at work because you're a staff member that fills a function and a role. So to some degree, you kind of lose your personal ability to do what you please. So when you're there representing, this is the really kind of the key thing. When you think of the colleges of the various colleges, whether it's pharmacy, physician, nurses and stuff, they expect you to act in your place as a professional. In other words, you represent the organization. So they will hold you to a standard that may be harder from an abstract perspective, even though from a tangible perspective, you may say, what's the harm in doing this? What's the harm in giving a patient a couple extra pills? What's the harm in it? Or not giving the pills just to put it in my pocket so I can have them and sell them. So I absolutely agree with what you're saying, is the fact that who we are versus who we ought to be. Who decides who we ought to be? And so that's why when you are acting in a role, in a professional capacity, you lose your autonomy. And you have to make the choice of acting within a professional context. And that's what really this is a kind of a key thing. So if your job was to sell a cake and your business was the doors were open, then technically you cannot discriminate against, simply because two people wanted to put rooms on top of the cake. And it's kind of and this is where you start getting into what is ethics, right? Versus what is morals. Stealing a canister of oxygen is not good. Unless you use it for good purposes. But you'll be held to an account, an abstract account, which you may think, I don't agree with it. And to some degree, that's what they call a utilitarian, where the reason why they hold individuals to a group standard, even though it harms the individual, is because the group standard is more important. And what's fascinating here is that when you are on your own time, on your own nickel, on your own dime, whether you still could be held accountable to a nursing standard. Give you an example. There was a nurse that was in Alberta that was sanctioned by the nursing association, the college. Because what she did was her grandfather was in a long-term care facility 100 miles away, 100 kilometers away from where she worked. And she wrote a blog that criticized the care that person was receiving, and was critical specifically of nurses, but not of specific nurses. And it was found out that she was because she was critical of other nurses, which was against their college standard, she was sanctioned. Even though she was writing this on her own personal time, her own personal ideas, but because she was a member of the nursing college, she was not allowed to criticize her college. Because she was held, even though from a personal standpoint, she felt that the nurses did not provide a standard of care. It was not adequate. It was not professional. And she called them out. So again, this is really important to understand that who you are as an individual and who you are in the workplace as a worker within is almost different, isn't it? Does anybody feel that in the past? Like, so you can look at a bank robber or a rapist and say, you're a terrible person, but I can't not treat you. That's my standard, right? That's the ethical standard, says you ought to. A rapist was chased down by a mob and beaten and was brought to your hospital, and then you are the nurse that has to help this rapist back to health. You know? Well, nobody's looking to kind of give him an elbow. Make sure that when you put the Band-Aid on, you rip it off really hard. Be able to separate who you are as a person, what your morals on, versus your ethics. Ethics are a little bit more broader. Is that making sense to people, what I'm saying? The world, unfortunately, is full of great examples where people's individual morals interfere with the organizational ethic. To the point where, because individuals act in a challenging way, it impacts the reputation of the organization, and vice versa. We've all worked in environments where the people are less than ethical. We've also worked in environments where everybody's held to a higher standard. So it's, you know, why is it that we study ethics? So when people say, what's ethics all about? It's really about separating who you are as an individual to some degrees, who you are as a professional, and trying to reconcile so the two of them can live together in harmony. Does that make sense? So we talked about, last week, we talked about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, non-malfeasance. Big words, eh? Basically, do good, don't do harm. Equity, which is justice and fairness. Dignity, which I'm expanding it because the textbook talks about fidelity, which is basically what's your integrity and your best actions. In other words, you don't have the right not to bring your best efforts. So if you are unable to do a particular procedure, you don't want to fudge your way through it. You want to tell people, I need to bring in somebody who has more skills. Even if it's a person that you don't like, if they're better at it, would you refer to them? Really important. Truth. I want you to go back. I want to go back and talk about autonomy for a minute. Autonomy is not the same as license. Do you know what that means? License is the ability to do what you want to do. It's like there's an expression that says, your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose, which means that you can go like this all you want, but you can't hit me, even though your autonomy may you like this, right? It's the difference between autonomy and license. You have the right not to wear a mask, except of course, when you are in an environment where the greater good means that we have to prevent the spread. And since 1/3 of the people who have COVID, positive COVID, don't have symptoms, I'm going to take away your autonomy on the basis of its good. So just simply because you say I have autonomy and freedom doesn't give you license to harm others. I have autonomy to drive. Why can't I drive as fast as I want on the highway? It's not the same, right? That's what autonomy versus license, restrictions. So that's an important thing, because in autonomy, to go back to that question, if you are a healthcare provider, autonomy is a huge thing. People have the right to make a choice, even though if you don't agree with the choice, but they don't have the right to force you to do something where you don't think it's in their best interest. You bring your fidelity to it. It's what you don't believe to be true. It's like last week we heard the story of the person who was the dentist, who said that a woman came in and said, take away all my teeth. Even though there's nothing wrong with the teeth, she just decided that she didn't want teeth. If you're the dentist, would you do it? No, it's not the same, right? Some dentists would, but most wouldn't. So we talk about the world having objective moral structure. Do you know what that means? I mean, we believe that there's a sort of a central truth somehow. It's hard to define, and that's where ethics comes in, because everyone will argue what that truth is. We talked about meta-ethics, which is ethical non-cognitivism, which basically everyone yelling at each other and trying to convince people that what they think is wrong and they ought to think like I do, versus ethical cognitivism, which is basically having two people to share what they believe to be true to them. Discussion. Ethical relativism, we saw a video about what is relative. You know, this idea that who am I to judge? We saw the video that said, well, you know, everybody has a right to do what they want as long as it doesn't harm somebody. But then there's a limit to it. Ethical realism and objectivism, which is basically saying, well, wait a minute now, people live in a tangible environment. They live in a real place. And you can't just simply say every person to themselves. Because we talk about pluralism, which is basically saying, yeah, everyone has the right to live their own life, to be their own person and stuff, to a point. When it starts causing harm to others, then you intervene. And we talk about cultural plurality, which says that if some cultures believe it to be wrong, in other words, if one culture says it's wrong for two men to marry or two women to marry, culturally defined, but can they find a way to coexist? Pluralism, the ability to say, yes, everything's relative, but only to a point. We talked about deontological, which is people have a right to choose individually. As opposed to utilitarianism, where we're talking about a lot of public health. You ought not to throw your poop in the street. We ought to do with it better. And rights. I have a right to walk around the street naked. Who is it harming anybody? Oh, wait a minute. Now, if everybody walked around the street naked, they would be like, what, chaos? What's my right? We're going to talk about right, because when we get into the World Health Organization Declaration of Human Rights, it's going to be really interesting. We talked about virtue-based, talked about duties, sort of your duty to not harm people. Didn't talk a lot about feminist ethics, but it's in the text. Communitarianism and liberalism, principles of utility, categorical imperative, practical imperative, hedonism, my ability just to satisfy what I feel is my own right, but only to, I have the right to pursue things that make me feel happy, and I have a right to pursue things that take away my pain. Absolutism, which is the belief that there are firm rights and wrongs. And consequentialism is that the rights of, it's how you evaluate an ethical situation on the basis of what the consequences are. We've seen various videos that deal with this. We've seen these relativism, hedonism, consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontological, moral pluralism, and moral absolutism. We've seen these videos, I've shown them in the past. I'll have the links up so you can look at them again. Now, why does this matter? Because we're going to talk about the Declaration of Human Rights. And what does it mean? So we've been now going for just about an hour, so we're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it means and what it doesn't mean. And then at the end of today's session, I'm going to talk about the assignment that's due next week. Okay. Any questions? So we're going to be jumping into the discussion about the World Health Organization's Declaration of Human Rights. Hopefully you can hear me well now. I've got my microphones back in. I'm just experimenting with different, just to make sure that you can hear me all right. I know I have a tendency to drone on and on and on. So hopefully it's, so what are people thinking so far? What we're talking about, does it make sense to you? Does it sort of, is it helpful? Let me just, I'm checking in with you guys to sort of see how things are going. So far, so good? You'll let me know if it's not?
Yes, Professor, it's good.
Again, the key thing here is, you know, even when I went through that whole list of terms, people think, oh, do I have to memorize all those terms? I think it's important you understand some of the key concepts, and certainly chapter 1 goes into those concepts. And so that's sort of a reading, but if you're still trying to work it out, I would encourage you just to look at some of the videos again, or to just simply look up on Wikipedia some of the ideas. But they're kind of foundational, because when we start getting into specifically talking about things that, like for example, what's informed consent? What's substitute decision making? When do people have the capacity to make their own decisions and when do they not? And why does it matter if we as a professional have the ability to override? One of the things that is interesting is that in Ontario, under the Mental Health Act, it's presumed that people under the age of 16 don't have the capacity to make and give consent. Presumed. But under the Child and Family Services Act, which I think has been renamed, apologies, I don't remember the new name, it's presumed that anybody over the age of 12 has the ability to give and make consent. So if you're 14 years old and you have a mental health problem and you're being served in the mental health system, It's really kind of an interesting conundrum. Do you give consent? Do you get consent? And this is why some of the things that we've talked about in the past, what's utilitarianism, what's deontologicalism, what's consequentialism, what's blah, 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 kind of matters, because you can take a particular case, a tangible thing, and think about it. One of the most challenging parts of mental health treatment is treating adolescents. Because in order to be able to give consent to participate in research studies, you have to be of a certain age. And so if I've tested my psychiatric medications on adults over the age of 19, or at least people that are able to give consent, what does it say when I want to give a medication to a 12 or 13-year-old? Can I give an atypical antipsychotic to a 10-year-old who has autism? You think, well, no, but that's a common thing. How can you justify it from a medical perspective? How can you justify it from an ethical perspective? Two different things, isn't it? We've heard of something called off-label use, where a medication is particularly approved for something and people start using it for something else. Everybody's probably heard of the term Viagra. Viagra was really not a very good heart medication. Middle of the road, didn't really do much. But it had a really good side effect. And so suddenly, after 10 years sitting on the shelf doing nothing, people started saying, hey, wait a minute, that side effect is helpful to some. So suddenly I start prescribing the medication, not for heart disease, but because I like the side effect that it produces. Big seller. So off-label use suddenly now becomes, now they've looked at it and it's a whole new category of medicines. Let me share my screen. So the World Health Organization says it's the recognition of the inherent dignity, inequality, and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Seems like a fair thing to say. And they hold for all people, irrespective of their national, ethnic, religious affiliations or origins, and they apply irrespective of gender, age, or condition. And a right is an entitlement, a justified claim, whether I act on it or not. I have a right, if it's true, to walk around the street without my shirt on, if I'm a male, going to the beach. And there were some people who said, wait a minute now, I'm being discriminated against based on my gender. And so there were women who said, I ought to be able to also walk around the street without a shirt on. Doesn't matter whether I do it or not, but I have a justified right. And the Ontario government said yes. Why am I bringing that up? Because again, just because you have a justified claim, it doesn't mean you act on it. But issue is that you have a right. It's entitlement. irrespective of gender, age, or condition. All persons are autonomous beings worthy of respect and as such have the fundamental right to self-determination that is limited only by unjust infringement on the rights of others. So again, autonomy doesn't give you license, but it's an important thing, isn't it? Let me share my screen for a minute for something else. So hopefully you see this. This is a picture of a person that looks like they're jumping out of an egg. What this is, make it a little bit bigger. This is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the United Nations. Let's take a look at some of these. Article 1. All humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But there's a group, every group has a society, right? Every group has a group. In Canada, we had our Indigenous populations that we threw into residential schools. I've seen documentaries, and whether or not that's true or not is I've seen, you know, the Untouchables in Indian others, or people that are considered to be part of the servant class. They're born free and equally in dignity and rights. Now, is this the law that I'm showing you? No, it's not the law. We'll talk about that in a minute. Is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without such as race, color, language, sex, religion, political, or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. No distinction shall be made on the basis of political, jurisdictional, or international status, whether or not to be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or limiting. So, people who are permanent residents of Canada, even though they're not citizens of Canada, have a right to come to Canada and not be denied. There was a lot of discussion about taking away citizenship from people who commit crimes. That's not right. Everybody has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. That's how the abortion laws in Canada got pushed down. Because by asking a woman to submit to a panel of people who made a determination whether or not their abortion was in their medical interest or not, because the panel couldn't meet immediately because there was a backlog, it put the woman's health at risk. And therefore, from a security of person, section 7 and 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that was an affront to their security as a person. So the law was said, it was struck down, and nobody has brought another one back. But in the US, many states have come in and said, can't have the surgeries, can't have the treatments done in hospitals that receive funding from government. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Is slavery and servitude the same? No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. So even if you're a really bad guy, a bad lady, and I throw you in jail, I can't punish you if it's considered to be cruel and inhumane. So in Canada, we had if you committed a murder in the first degree and you're found guilty of it, you were given an automatic 25-year sentence without eligibility for parole. And that law was put in as it eliminated capital punishment, in other words, ability to kill you. And people thought that was inhumane, degrading, and a cruel punishment. To 25 years without eligibility parole. In other words, showing people that you have rehabilitated. Is prison, is it torture? Is prison rehabilitation? Is prison punishment? It's great questions, aren't they? Everyone has the right to be recognized everywhere as a person before the law. All are equal before the law and entitled without discrimination to equal protection of the law. So I have the right to go to any beautician salon I can and give the treatment that I believe I want. As long as it's done on others, it can be done on me. In this case, the beauty salon was found to have violated that woman's right to receive the same treatment as everybody else. And they ought to have employed somebody who would be able to do that. Everybody has the right to effective remedy by competent national tribunal for acts violating the fundamental rights granted to him by the Constitution or by law. So, what does that mean? Well, now we have this international court in The Hague talking about crimes against humanity. And a lot of it had to do with people who committed atrocities in the name of war. Cultural genocide, physical genocide. A lot of times they looked at what the Nazis had done. They looked at what happened in Somalia. They looked at some of the places around the world in Africa where things are being done. You've heard the expression ethnic cleansing. This idea that we're going to eliminate, get rid of certain minority groups. And so in theory, you could be brought to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to be tried for your crimes. Now, I said, what about the Canadian Medical Association, as if to say that somehow they're committing crimes against humanity. But chapter 2 of our textbook, and when we get into assignment 2, which is to look at the developments of our ethical policies when it comes to our various colleges, they kind of look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and say, this is what we believe. So let's sort of think about this. So what's the point when you talk about the Declaration of Human Rights? What's the point that we are trying to make? So this is the points, and I'm going to throw them. I'm not going to reveal them. I'm just going to show them all at once. You know, when you say that everybody has this inherent right, it makes an assumption that the world has an objective moral structure. But we know, we look at what goes on in North Korea, what goes on in Russia, what goes on in China, what is, to some extent, what goes on in Canada and what goes on in the United States, and say, wait a minute now, there's a problem. So is this objective moral structure universally shared? The answer is no. So in the United States, when they fight against this idea that we ought to teach people about slavery and the harm it did, they're saying it's just a bunch of cultural imperialists, or in this case, elitists, or what they call the woke culture, wanting to impose their views on others. So do I have a right to go to China and say, your human rights abuses ought to have stopped? Yesterday, when Vladimir Putin, the Russian Tsar, I don't know if he's the prime minister, president. He switches back and forth in order to remain in power. Somebody asked him a question: is how come all the people that oppose you in politics are either dead or in prison? It's true. So we say you ought not to be able to imprison your opponents just simply because they don't like you. But is that just simply because we feel morally superior and we ought to believe because the United Nations says that everybody's right and everybody has the freedoms? Does that mean everybody has to follow them? So the person that said, I'm not going to bake my cake for two same-sex couples, to a same-sex couple, it's this in cultural imperialists, the woke culture, the people that are trying to impose their views on me. If I don't believe it's to be a good thing, I don't have to do it. So can we really agree there's ethical or acceptable or unacceptable actions in that objective sense? So this goes back to this question, what's the nature of ethics? So if you had to think about 3 of your top ethical concepts, what would they be? So if you were, for example, and I'll try to be respectful of this because I know it's a challenging one, but I'm trying to find an example where you guys would know this a lot better than I am, and it's controversial. So let's think about what goes on in Kashmir. Let's think about how a group of people led by Mr. Modi believes that there should be one India, that everyone ought to be, for the good of the country, ought to be the same. And therefore I have the right to restrict the independence that some people in Kashmir believe they have. Whereas there are people in Kashmir who say, listen, we've been existing as a kind of a dual entity, even though we're proud to be Indian. We have a dual identity and we have, to some degree, some independence. We ought to be able to find our freedoms and our liberties based on that. As long as we're not harming anybody, why do you want to change what we are? Why do you want to promote one religion over another? Again, I'm not trying to be controversial when I ask this question, but when you look at the Kashmir conundrum, you can see how people's various ethical beliefs get mired and mixed into the discussions. Does anybody else have another example they want to use, or does anybody want to sort of comment on what I've been saying? Did my camera fall off? Did nobody hear anymore? Hello? I'm gonna look at the chat. Nope, nothing in the chat. Roshni, do you have something to offer? This is a,
No,
nope.
every,
Go ahead.
everybody's quite, yeah, Rajat is right. Kashmir is a huge debate between India and Pakistan. He's
Yeah.
writing in chat box.
It is, and I know it's like I throw a what they call a stink bomb into a room, and everyone,
And
everyone's
also,
sort of holding their breath.
Professor, there are two communities of people in Kashmir. Like one is Kashmiri Pandits, and another is like who they want to live independent.
We have that here in Canada. We have Quebec, and we have Canada. The United States fought a civil war over that same thing about the right to hold slaves and hold property. So every country in the world has this issue. So in no way am I sort of pointing out that Kashmir is unique. It is unique because of the people and the cultures and the history. It absolutely is unique. But I just want to say that I'm not pointing it out to be critical of it. I'm just sort of saying, here is an example of a really difficult, hard to resolve problem. And if you want to be ethically non-cognitive, you just yell at each other. Try to convince them that they're wrong. If you want to think about it from an ethical perspective, you can look at the varying positions. That doesn't mean you don't have an opinion, but you can sort of see that there are different opinions held by different people and the reasons why. And our job is not to look at those reasons and say, that's wrong. If I'm a deontological person, I could say I have a right to exist. If I'm a United Nations declaration of, I ought to be able to be unencumbered by the state's unjustifiable infringement on my liberties. If I'm a utilitarianism, I'd say, well, look, we can't just simply have laws that are applied whenever somebody wants them to apply. We have to have the rule of law. We have to have structure. We have to have for the greater good, even if it means that we have to limit the individual freedoms of people. Both are valid. And that's what makes ethics interesting. And that's why we're going to have you do assignment 1. So let's just look at our screen again. So let's think about stakeholders. So who are we, what are we referring to, and who we're referring to? And are there some stakeholders that matter more? Like, for example, should my opinion about what should go on in Kashmir, do I have any status? I have no idea. I mean, it's what I read by somebody else who wrote stuff. Like people would say, you cannot, you don't know anything. No. Am I a stakeholder?
No, Professor.
Who is a stakeholder?
The people who are affected.
And who are
And
they?
Policies. The
Mhm.
government.
Yeah. But am I allowed to comment on it?
You can have an opinion, but I don't think so. You are allowed to have comment on it.
See, I can look at it from an ethics perspective. But it's a bit like me criticizing your family, right? But we talked about the issue of judgment. Remember, judgment becomes this really hard thing. Because even though we say, from an ethical relativism standpoint, we can say, yeah, everybody has the right to do what they want. Who am I to judge? But that's the problem, we judge. Because I don't have family members, because I don't have an emotional stake in Kashmir, I could probably comment on it from an ethics perspective. But when you start getting into the emotion and the family, it's hard. Just like in Canada, we struggle with this fact that we have a terrible legacy when it came to how we treated our Indigenous population. But it's complicated because still people think, well, they didn't set out to, well, they set out to change people, but the thinking at the time was that was okay. And that's what I talked about, the cancel culture, which is to go back and make you atone for the quote unquote sins of your father and your father's father. They say that the Catholic Church that ran some of the residential schools ought to pay and apologize for the way that our Indigenous population were treated. That was other people, right? If I had a family member, uncle, who got arrested for being drunk and ran over somebody and killed them, am I responsible? Would you be responsible for that behavior? Well, it depends, because if somebody's then saying, you're related to that person, so therefore you're like him, that's judgment, right? Let's talk about what's a stakeholder? What are we thinking about?
So maybe the incidents or any organization to which the person belongs, they are the stakeholders.
They are. So if you're working for a hospital and that hospital was seen as not treating people well, or choosing not to help people based on their need, but choosing to help them based on whether they could pay or not. You can argue both sides of that. Doesn't mean it's, you have to hold that one is therefore, that because you can debate both sides, it doesn't mean that you don't have an idea or an opinion. And that's what sort of bit of the theme here is to reconcile that when you're in a work environment, what your ethics are held to the standard of your profession versus held to the standard of your individual. So if my organization had a firm policy against discrimination, and I, as the baker, said, I'm not going to let you take this cake because I don't like same-sex marriage, then I'm imposing my personal views on an organization. And the organization ought to be able to sanction me and to be accountable for me because I'm working in their employee. Stakeholders, to some degree, your actions are judged by others. Again, what we're talking about here is when you judge others. So stakeholders are people who judge others. Now, are there some people who are more important than others? Yeah, the people directly involved. And then there's people who are peripherally involved. So the stakeholders get a lot bigger if you are a utilitarian, which says that the greater good ought to overcome the right of individual freedoms. I ought to compel you to wear a mask if you're in public. Give you a specific example. So if you come into my business and you're not wearing a mask, and I say you have to wear a mask, or else you don't get to shop in my business. That's caused a lot of hassle in the US, a lot of hardship. You can't make me, even though that's my private business. When you walk through my doors, that's my business, my home. I can decide what you want, what can be done. So the governors, they said, oh, well, okay, so we're going to pass a law that says everyone's got to wear a mask when you're out in public. Now that they've rescinded the law in some places, because they think, oh, well, we're vaccinated now. And a person comes into my store, do I still have the right to say, you got to wear a mask? Again, I can set the terms and conditions as long as I don't, quote unquote, discriminate against you. But people say, you're discriminating against my freedom. You're preventing me from having the autonomy that I want, my liberties. Complicated, isn't it? It's complicated and it's not. So I want you to sort of think about ethics when in terms of the workplace, the work environment, the organizational structures, the things that it ought to support versus what the individual feels. And vice versa. That's what we mean by stakeholders. So let's think about this. I've thought about trying to engage the class in some of our discussions, but I recognize that these are complicated things and people are not wanting to be judged. So therefore they're less likely to share some of their own personal observations. And I understand that, I really do. But we've all faced discrimination of sorts. Let me give you an example right now. So in Quebec used to have a very strong affiliation with religion, in particular the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church sort of said, well, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we ought to do it. And that's why you see a lot of symbolisms around church when it look at government stuff. But Quebec made a decision to say that, look, why is it that we are promoting only one religion over another? Why is it that we have to have any religion whatsoever in our government? Why can't people just sort of exist however they want to believe and however they want to celebrate? But we as a government ought not to be promoting one religion over another. So they said, we're going to pass a law that said we're going to remove religious symbols from our government structures. So in the legislature in Quebec, they took away the cross that was in the legislature. But at the same time, they said that if you work in a government position, you cannot wear a hijab, you cannot wear a turban, you cannot wear crosses, you cannot have visible symbols of your faith, of your religion. People said, but wait a minute now, don't I have freedom of expression when it comes to my religion? Yeah, well, Walt Disney has a rule that says you can't, if a man, you can't have facial hair. If you're a woman, you can't have earrings that are bigger than a nickel. Your hair has to be a natural color. It can't be blue and pink and stuff. So organizations have these rules, right? Whether they're religion or whatever, there's just stuff, right? So how do you frame an ethical dilemma? So let's just take a look at what the book says, because this is about assignment 1 now. We think about some ethical principles. What matters to us? If we sort of say the ethical principles we ought to adopt are the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. We think that's the objective moral standard, that everybody in the world ought to be held to that standard. Then we think of the situation that we've experienced. And then we think about it from when two or more principles interact and create a conflict. We think, well, what are the rules that were governing the situation? Utilitarianism versus deontological. We ought to treat every patient as an individual. Wait a minute now, we ought to treat every patient in a common way. So we list the elements that affect the ethical standards. And then we identify what's the biggest source of conflict. Again, we're not here to say what's right and what's wrong. That's not where we're at. This is the perspective of one group of people. This is the perspective of another group of people. And then we look at the facts. And then we say, well, what do we think ought to have happened? So we have to think of a situation from different perspectives. Remember, we're not talking about breaking a law. We're not talking about making a medical error. And if there was a medical error, you remove the wrong tooth. It's not about that error per se. It's like, what do you do afterwards? Do you disclose to the patient that you made an error? Do you say, yep, it was our error, we're going to compensate you? You try to hide it so that nobody sees it, because the greater good is that if I have to pay you for my medical error, I'm going to lose the ability to, I'm going to lose my license, and therefore I can't help a whole bunch of people. So when my friend, when my staff member decided that she was going to accept the charge against her insurance for the higher level stent, she made an ethical decision that it's okay, but even though it's fraud. Does everybody sort of understand where I'm going with this? And again, when you're doing assignment 1, I want you to think about the underlying terms and concepts. So big ones are autonomy from a medical perspective. Remember, autonomy, beneficence, which is do good if you can, if it doesn't harm you. And then don't cause harm unless it harms you. Dignity, bring the best you can to the situation. Be truthful. We also talk about utilitarianism, the greater good. Public health is based on that. I could force you not to dump your chemicals into the stream because it harms more people, even though it infringes upon your liberties. So those are some of the concepts that we've had. So we talked very quickly about stakeholders and dilemmas. We talked about models, and we talked about how you think about solutions. Now, I'm going to challenge the term solutions. I know this was in the notes. I don't know if there's always a solution. Now, a solution doesn't necessarily mean that there is a absolute truth. In other words, there's right and there's wrong, nothing in between. But we know there's elements of gray. So absolutism is there's a right and there's a wrong. So you shouldn't kill people. But then they have, unless of course they're trying to kill you first. You should do good for people, unless doing so makes it harmful. So the physician that I know, the physician that was the first one to sort of characterize COVID-19, who went in and treated these people, died doing that work. So you can argue, well, that's kind of stupid because they did harm to themselves, you know. So I'm trying to read the body language and the facial expressions. How are people doing? So reread chapter 1 and think about each example. Here's the challenge about ethics. Ethics is hard because it's very circular. It's like I would never want to be a member of a club that accept me as a member, which is kind of a circular kind of logic, right? And that's what chapter 1 is, a bit circular, because it's saying, well, what about this? What about that? And then it becomes, well, it's all gumbled up and garbled together. The key here is to look at a situation and place out from different perspectives what they would be holding on to, what would be important to them. So what we're going to do now for the remainder of today's session is this is the end of the formal discussion, the formal presentations. And then I'm going to give people an opportunity to work on assignment 1. They can work on it online, they can leave, it's up to you guys. I will be here for the session, so you can decide how best to proceed. So let me check in with everybody. How are people doing right now? Are you overwhelmed? Are you underwhelmed? Are you kind of...
A little bit overwhelmed.
Okay. So what is it that, yeah?
Because I feel after reading some parts of the textbook and everything that ethics is kind of a tricky thing to understand. Sometimes I do understand it and the same sentence I don't understand the next time. It is a little bit perspective, and I kind of I'm finding it a little bit difficult to understand right now.
So that's a very helpful thing. Does anybody also does people also feel that way? Yeah. Probably do, but people aren't going to put their thumbs up because they don't want to admit that they don't know. I'm judging. So that's why ethics is to some degree hard, and it's also boring. But I want you to sort of, what I'm encouraging you to do is to sort of break it down into kind of simpler ideas. Greatest good versus individual freedoms. Who you are as a person versus who you are as a professional. So think about situations where a patient's autonomy wasn't respected. At the same time, think of a situation where a patient was asking somebody to do something that you didn't think was right, and so you refused. Really the key to this assignment is to think of a problem that it kind of caused you to be, I'm not really comfortable with it. And then list the stakeholders. And as open-mindedly as you can, to try to list what their motivation would be. Morals, ethics, hard. But what we want you to grasp for this assignment is the way in which you think about and discuss it. So again, list the situation. List without judgment the stakeholders and what they may have been thinking. And just as a hint, you can't say, we have no idea what this stakeholder is thinking because they're dumb. Or they're just completely, you don't know what it is, right? That's not good enough. You have to sort of think, why would they? So why is it acceptable for some people to believe they don't have to wear masks? Why is it acceptable for me to force you to wear a mask? There's legitimate issues on both sides, right? And that's what makes this really complicated. Because again, we've talked a little bit about in the past when India had a real tough time with COVID, and they worked really hard to get COVID numbers down significantly. And then somebody made the decision that they're going to say, oh, we've cured this, we fixed this, we're not on the road, we're almost better now. And then it wasn't. And then the Delta variant hit, and then big again. And then they locked it all down. And now we're doing well. And so these are people making decisions about, well, we want the economy to be strong, because if there's no sense in protecting all people if they're going to die from starvation and no jobs. It only affects 2%, 3%, 4% of the population. What do we care? There are people who believe that, yes, even though in the US 500,000 people died, they said, well, they would have died of something else. So let me touch base again. So what can I do to help you with assignment 1? Besides tell you what to write, even though I've told you what to write. If you look at the rubric, really just it can be self-writing. What's the situation? Who are the stakeholders? What were they thinking? How is their thinking aligned with various ethical models? Even if you found that you did not act as you had wanted to act, even if you went along to get along, which is perfectly fine, even though as we saw bounded ethicality, which basically says, we do have to work and live in a team. Even though I saw people cheating, even though I saw people stealing, if I were to identify them as being cheaters and stealers, then that would be hard for me to coexist. If you saw your mama, go ahead.
We have to write 3 pages. Like necessarily we must have to write 3 pages.
It's up to you, but I think 3 pages is the max. If you saw your mom and dad or your grandparents or your auntie or uncle cheating on their taxes, would you report them?
No, I won't.
Why not?
I don't find it right to, like, my morals towards my country fall down in front of my morals towards my parents or my relatives here.
So your loyalties and your individual ideas. But if everybody cheated on their taxes and nobody paid taxes, and then you couldn't afford hospitals or schools, would you feel that was bad?
Yes.
And that's tangible versus abstract. And that's okay. It's honest, right? That's truth. it's hard, isn't it? One of the examples that I've again, I've seen from past is that some of the, some people write about how when they were working in a pharmacy, it's back in India, when they're working in a pharmacy, the pharmacist was fudging the inventory numbers, recording a few less pills because that pharmacist was taking the pills and selling them on the black market or on the underground market. And so the argument was, well, if it's a code of ethics, should you have not told the organization that this person's stealing? And people said, no, I'm not going to do it. But if they came to me and asked me, I wouldn't lie. I would be, if you asked me to tell the truth and compelled me to tell the truth, I would. And remember, we watched that video which says that people are a little bit dishonest. It's human nature, right? They'd steal the can of Coke, but they wouldn't steal the dollar bill on the fridge. They'd steal the pencil from work, but they wouldn't steal the quarter that would buy the pencil. But judgment is what we would do versus what you'd expect others to do. What do you want the greater good to do versus what do you want the individual to do? Hard, isn't it? The most important thing to realize here is that I'm not judging you when I read these. I'm judging you on your ability to tell me a situation and tell me the list of the stakeholders and what they're thinking, using some of the ethical concepts. And again, we're not saying, I'm not going to look for you to give me an academic paper on consequentialism. But if you believed that the outcome mattered, so therefore you're willing to accept. So when my friend decided that it's okay for them to do insurance fraud, because the consequence of it was that 7 other people who had heart disease who would not be able to be treated because they couldn't afford to it were now treated. The consequence of it was good. That was greater good. That was a thing. So therefore, some nameless, faceless corporation that had to pay a little bit extra, they're making money anyway, who cares? So to see how that thinking kind of flows into a discussion. Most important thing, I guess, maybe in order to provide advice on how best to do this assignment, is to think about that ethical dilemma that you thought about, or you saw, or you heard about. Write it out, a paragraph on what it was. Tell me the people that were involved, whether they were directly involved or indirectly involved. And then try to find a way to say, how could they ethically justify their actions? And that's 90% of the essay. And the last little bit is, so when you think about all this, what do you think ought to have happened? I'm going to give you an opportunity to do, the question is, do we have to mention the dilemma from a professional aspect, or can it be personal? Personal is fine too. If it allows you to work through the ethical concepts, I'm good with it too. Because as I said to you before, is that when you become a dentist, or you become a nurse, or become a pharmacist, and you have the code of conduct, code of ethics for your profession. You have to sort of take almost a dual identity. You as a pharmacist versus you as a person who's a pharmacist. And you as a pharmacist are somehow held to a higher standard, just like a politician. If we accept our parents cheating on their taxes, having affairs, lying in their personal life, and we discover that's what they have done, and they're a politician, do we now judgment to say, well, you're likely going to do that when you're a politician? See how it kind of plays out? We make it a point of saying, you know, if we don't like Mr. Modi, we show the things that Mr. Modi has done that we think are ethically wrong personally, and then we therefore make judgments. Or if we like Mr. Modi, we'll say, well, what he's decided to do is rational. It works because we're talking about the greater good. People are still kind of going, I'm not sure. Make the problem go away from me, right?
Professor, I
Yes.
have a question. In rubrics, there is, and one point is how full and detailed information is included, how the situation came to awareness, and how did it become an issue. What exactly we have to write in this? How it become an issue? Because earlier it was stated that write full detailed information why this is an ethical dilemma. So it's almost same.
So what do you think?
Not sure.
Well, let's talk it through. So what are the competing ideas?
How this situation,
Let's restate. Yeah, let's restate the problem. Okay. So restate the problem again.
sorry,
Give me the question again.
how this situation came to awareness and how did it become an issue? But the same thing, maybe we have already written in a full detailed explanation of why this is an ethical issue and in the summary. So
Yeah.
it's almost
So
how it become an issue.
yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. Situation happened at work. These two people were in a conflict because they felt that the patient care wasn't done the correct way. One person thought it should be done this way. One person should be thought it this way. The first person, they were arguing from this perspective. The second person was arguing from that perspective. See how it sort of flows? If we were to sit and we were neutral and just observing it, this is what we would see, the conflict between this versus that.
Okay, Professor.
Did I answer your question? It's a great, very good question. Roshni, it's a very good question.
Thank you, Professor.
But that's the essence of it. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to start working on it. And the more you write, the more it evolves and becomes clearer to you. Don't write to judge yourself. One of the biggest challenges here is that, of course, when you think about ethics, you think about the academic part of the ethics, where you're looking at all these terms and all this stuff, and you think, oh, I don't know this stuff. But write about a time that you thought, it's not too good. Write it out. Even if it takes you a whole page to write out what happened. And then point out the people, the players. And then once you get starting to fill your pages worth of stuff, like, then you can kind of start knocking it back. Just don't try to do this the night before. Do it now. Start it now. Give yourself 20 minutes every couple days, just do it now. I'm going to wish you Sasrikal. Enjoy your time. I'm going to allow those who want to leave and to work on their assignment to go and do that. In the meantime, I will remain here to answer questions or to encourage you, to give you encouragement. But you guys got this. The biggest roadblock right now you're facing is that you want it to be perfect. Do it first and then make it better. Make it good, make it better. Force yourself to write the situation out on a piece of paper. Dear diary, today I saw. And then stakeholders. And then try to position yourself and imagine you're in their mindset and argue their position. Because again, if it's just about me yelling at you, telling you what you did wrong, that's non-cognitivism. That doesn't take much. But if I'm going to think about how do I respect somebody else's point of view, even though I think it's wrong, it does help us to understand and to listen. And that's what we need to be able to do when we are respecting the autonomy of our patients, is to listen. First, listen without judgment, and then placing yourself in the situation. Are we good? So I will turn my back and close my eyes. And so if anybody wants to leave, I'm not going to feel offended. But I'm going to be here for the remainder of today's session, okay?